Hey folks, my name is Loretta Vasili. I am the artistic director of the Mechanical Theater, and I thought it might be fun, for me at least, to put out a little podcast about our upcoming production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which will be happening at Laurel Hill Cemetery the 20th, 21st, 27th, and 28th of July. So basically starting tonight. Yeah, this podcast is a little late. And just thinking how it might be fun to discuss some of the ideas that are explored in Midsummer. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go through all of them, because if one could go through all the ideas that are explored in a piece like Midsummer or any Shakespearean play in one sitting, people would not have been doing them for the last 400 years and probably well into the future. So I guess the best way of putting it is, here are some of the ideas that we at the Mechanical Theater explored, not to suggest that there aren't many, many more. I had a theater teacher in college that referred to the work of Anton Chekhov and the work of Shakespeare as just being bottomless. So, there's really no way to sort of stop talking about them, but we will stop because I don't want this to go on forever. So, Midsummer Night's Dream basically breaks down into a story about a group of teenagers and a group of wannabe artists who wander into the forest that happens to be filled with supernatural beings of extraordinary power, and somehow they all don't die. That's really what this play is about, and that I think is why it's fascinating and why it simultaneously feels incredibly random and yet also makes absolute sense, even if you haven't actually seen it or heard it before. I do feel it has that kind of uncanny, maybe uncanny isn't the right word, but the strange quality to it where it's like, why does anything in this play happen the way it does? And yet, it makes sense that things happen in this play the way it does. Honestly, the description that I just gave sounds a little like the beginning of a slasher flick, quite frankly. You got 4 teenagers, they wander into the woods, and the woods are haunted, essentially, and yeah, we know how this story goes. There's some supernatural being that's going to kill them. It's going to end in bloodbath, and, however slasher flicks end, somebody thinks that the being is dead, like, whatever. I don't watch a lot of horror, despite having worked often in a cemetery. But yeah, it has that feel like, we all know how this story goes, and yet you don't. In this particular play, nobody dies. And in a weird way, I feel like the story is kind of conscious of the fact that this could have gone horribly, horribly wrong. Something that we had a little fun with, because we happened to be performing this play in a cemetery, is the fact that the character of Puck seems determined to convince himself and the other fairies that he's some sort of ghost. He has this weird obsession with ghosts. And it's kind of strange, because at one point Oberon, I feel like this might get cut from a lot of texts, a lot of versions of the play, where Oberon basically has to remind him, we're not ghosts, we're something else. Why do you keep getting hung up on this point? Like, we're not ghosts. Because we were doing it at a cemetery, Billy McHattie, who's playing Puck, and I discussed this, we have to leave in all this stuff about, he has these monologues where he goes on about, graves letting forth their sprites, etc., and, damned spirits trooping home to churchyards. We have to include them because we're in a freaking cemetery. This may be the only instance where any of these monologues make sense. So we have to have them. You have to perform them. So that's kind of a nice fun point about this particular rendition of the text. Couple other fun things that we kind of explored. I sort of saw this as a story about what happens when you leave the safety of your walled city, your place of logic and culture that kind of protects and insulates you. It all starts off with people deciding to leave Athens, and the connection there between Athens, reason, philosophy, like that sort of rational mindset. A carefully, a city with a very determined hierarchy, and a sense of law and legality, and leaving that to go out into the forest, which is chaos, which is haunted by the fairies, like Titania and Oberon, haunted by these agents of chaos, essentially, that are extraordinarily powerful. And then you go out there, and that action kind of refreshes not only the people who go out into it, but they are able to bring that back to the city, and that kind of refreshes the city and makes the city, if the city has become corrupt, which it kind of has at the beginning of Midsummer, that corruption is now kind of magically alleviated. Which is so strange, because in many ways there's no reason why. Basically, one of the characters, Hermia, has a death sentence, and at the end of the play, that death sentence is removed for no particular reason other than the fact that everybody ended up in the forest. That's why it's removed. It's a little more complicated than that, in my opinion. I feel like in many ways this play turns on Helena, the character of Helena. I think it is the fact that she's so in love with Demetrius and is willing to literally die for him, and says so much, and is willing to die for the love she feels for him, even if that means dying at his hands. And it's that commitment, that sort of heroic commitment, if you will, that sort of inspires Oberon, who happens to overhear her say that he decides, you know what? You're going to get what you want today. We're gonna tweak reality a little bit so it can work out for you, honey, because I like what you just said. So I would say that the reason they don't all end up dead is largely because Helena is willing to die. And that sort of ends up, saving the lovers and refreshing the corrupted system of Athens. And if you're curious what I mean by the corrupted system of Athens, I'm basically talking about the much maligned character of Aegeus. So Aegeus is Hermia's father, and you can tell, he basically only shows up in a couple of scenes, but he does make an impact. And he's also, exposition du jour. But he basically sets it up that he wants his daughter to marry Demetrius, and she's in love with Lysander, and now, he wants her to die unless she will marry with Demetrius. Now, the hilarious thing is, and we've talked about this a little bit, the actors and I, we have Colin Hatzel, who is playing Lysander, and Chris Naughton, who is playing Demetrius. We sort of teasingly said that, they're basically the same character. I think you could argue that Lysander is a little stronger, and Demetrius is a little bit more of a nerd who's trying to put on some bravado. But, they're both reasonably likable, and they're both reasonably silly. But basically, it's never given why he is so fixated on this. And Demetrius can't even be trusted because he's kind of already broken another girl's heart. No one ever explains it. It's just Aegeus has gotten fixated on it. And that to me is a symbol of the corruption, the sort of corruption of the father in many ways. He's not a bad guy. And he's hung up on rules, but sometimes rules are useful, but not when you follow them so rigidly and so arbitrarily that you don't take into consideration, the reality of individual people, I think is sort of what it's saying. It's sort of like, is it so terrible that he would, want to have an influence on his daughter's future and maybe consider himself a little more wise than she is? I mean, he probably is a little more wise than she is. However, you when you get to the point where it's like, obey me or die, clearly that's a bad idea. He is probably a lot wiser than Hermia, by the way. She does wander off into the woods as if that's a good idea. But, she's right to say, Dad, no. Anyhow, so we go through the final scene, and the interesting thing is Aegeus sort of points out that, the four lovers are here, and then he says, the law upon his head, that he's always about the law. He's always about, it's this sense of rigid adherence to rules, that without taking into consideration, matters of the heart, that kind of gets Aegeus into trouble. And wonderfully, the source of the rules, essentially, the person who's supposed to execute the rules, Theseus, basically says, Aegeus, I will overbear your will, so shut up. And the funny thing is, Aegeus just stops talking, and we kind of had this weird moment where we're like, well, Aegeus just kind of stops talking. We really should try to do something to sort of end his story. I'd love to have at least an explanation of some kind or other as to why we don't hear from him again. And Anthony Crosby, who's playing Theseus in Oberon, like at that point thought, oh yeah, I'll just do this. And he like pantomimed like shooting a pistol and killing Aegeus. And I have to admit, when I saw that, where it's like, yeah, just shoot him. And there, that explains why he doesn't talk again in the rest of the play. I'll be honest, I was really tempted to have that be what happens. I mean, there are so many instances in Shakespeare where it's like, and we never hear from this character again. Like, they have absolutely nothing to say. Like, maybe someone just shot them. Makes as much sense as anything. Wow, it would have been a very dark way. And that's like not even the final scene. Like, his body would have just have to been left there. Anyway, it was an idea. Now, at some point, I'd really like to try it. But we didn't go that route. We came up with a slightly gentler moment between Hermia and her father. A little bit of a redemption moment, a little bit of him perhaps realizing that he was a little too encased in his rules and needed to let go of that. Won't go into too much more details because I'd like y'all to actually see the show. I think you would enjoy it. It's quick, but it's fun. And we get to, finish his story. All right, so those are some of the ideas that I feel are encased in Midsummer Night's Dream. There's very, very, that's only a handful of them, but there are a couple that we got to play around with in this production. And obviously, there are only thousands upon thousands of ways to approach this text, because if there wasn't, people would have stopped doing it a long time ago. So anyway, folks, if you have a chance, please check us out. You can go to the laurelhillcemetery.org website and look for events if you'd like to get tickets. I think they're $20 a ticket, and the show is at 7, and the gates really open at 6, so if you want to get there a little early and bring a picnic dinner, it's BYOB, and we strongly encourage people come and have a lovely evening in the cemetery. Thanks so much, and hope to see you there.